So I said we were going to get to it, and here we are. So this is the King's College London. Yeah, it's King's College London. I think that's how it is, or it's college. Yeah, something like that. But yeah, two economics professors there have basically released a fact sheet, basically over the No Deal, which is the World Trade Organization option. So let's dive into it then. So the first part, what is the current situation? The World Trade Organization is the global body governing international trade. Member countries that do not have free trade agreement with each other trade under WTO rules. If the UK does not reach an agreement with the EU on a future trading relationship after Brexit, then the default position is the WTO rules. And these would apply on trade between the UK and the EU, and between the UK and third countries, including countries with which the EU has trade deals. So, what has the British government indicated it wants? The UK government has indicated that it wishes to negotiate a time-limited transitional period after Brexit, during which the UK remains effectively part of the single market and the EU customs union. After that, it wishes to see a, and this is quoting it, a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement between the EU and the UK. The EU has not ruled out a time-limited transitional period, but is prepared to negotiate on the future free trading relationship. It has stated that such negotiations cannot begin until terms of the withdrawal are settled under Article 50. And by the way, the new dipshit has basically said, we're not going to pay any money if we end up under a no-deal scenario. Congratulations. I just want to remind people of this. This money, and this money that always gets talked about, these are financial commitments we have already made pre-Brexit. So, think of this. Imagine you've bought out a loan and halfway through suddenly you decide, I'm not going to repay it because I'm moving somewhere else. You have, and the UK has a financial commitment to fulfill these requirements. This is not something you can just say, we're not going to pay, but, you know, this is the ideology of these guys kicking in. So, where are we? Time to... cannot begin until the withdrawal agreements are settled. Moreover, there are a number of substantive obstacles to a future trade agreement. So, what are the possible outcomes? If no agreement is reached by March 2019, or there is agreement on a transitional period, but none on a future relationship, then by default the UK will need to move to trading under the WTO regime, either by March 2019 or on the expiry of the transitional period. Both the UK government and the EU representatives have made statements implying that this outcome is the significant possibility. The UK is a member of the WTO in its own right, but various procedures are needed to re-establish our autonomy from the rest of the EU. In particular, we have to agree on schedules for tariffs on goods. The government has stated that in the short term it would simply replicate the schedules of the EU to smooth out transition. There are some more problematic areas, such as agreeing on the division of quotas for goods where the EU currently has agreed quotas at EU level. Yet, with enough goodwill and time, it should be relatively easy for the UK government to agree to get an agreement from the WTO members to operate under WTO rules. However, that's not as easy as they make it out to be. Remember, Australia and New Zealand are already threatening us under WTO terms, under these quotas. They will take us to the World Trade Organization's court because they are upset about the potential quotas that have already been offered to us. So our two close trading partners and these amazing trade deals that we're going to sign with these countries that Brexiteers have banged on about since the very beginning are going to take us to court. What good trading partners they are. It would also be necessary for the UK to negotiate with other countries which the EU has free trade agreements. This might be even more problematic. Under the WTO rules, each member must grant the same most favoured nation, and we've talked about this before, market access at all other WTO members. This means that exports to the EU would be subject to the same customs checks, tariffs and regulatory barriers that the UK and EU currently trade on, with such countries as the US. The UK's imports to the EU and other World Trade WTO members would also be subject to the importing country's most favoured nation tariffs. So, and we've talked about this in another video, these are not going to be good for us. You need, and we've talked about the fact that most countries now are moving forward to bilateral trade deals. You've only got to look at the EU-Japan deal. It was the biggest bilateral trade deal signed ever. And we're leaving that. We are not going to get a good a deal with Japan as we were with the EU. That is just fact. And a lot of people seem to just ignore those facts. So what are the potential consequences for these outcomes? So the imposition of tariffs with the EU would increase the costs for both UK importers and hence consumers and exporters. The average EU tariff rate is low. It is around 1.5%. However, at a sectorial level, the impacts would be much larger. For example, for cars and car parts, the tariff rate is 10%. Since most UK-based car production is exported and uses less imported parts, the impacts would be magnified. The impacts would be also large on agriculture, where EU tariffs and quotas remain high. This would result in significant food price inflation for British customers. The UK could alleviate the impact on consumers by reducing or eliminating tariffs unilaterally, as long as this is done in a non-discriminatory way. This would be permitted under WTO rules. However, this would have significant impacts on domestic producers, and we've talked about this before. The fact that, oh, we do this, oh, then what about the tariffs? Oh, we just get rid of the tariffs, and then they don't talk about the impacts on this. And I've said this before, the impacts on domestic producers are going to be huge. So, especially in agriculture, and we've talked about this before, 80% of small farmers go bankrupt. In any case, increased tariff barriers would not be the most important impact. The bulk of the cost of doing business across borders comes from non-tariff barriers such as checks, custom controls and compliance with different product standards and regulatory regulations across countries. These barriers cannot be removed unilaterally because they require trade partners to agree on a set of rules and regulations which they both accept. While the UK is in the EU, its businesses do not have to go through border checks because they already qualify as being compliant with EU rules and regulations. Under a hard Brexit WTO rules scenario, without mutual recognition for agreements on product standards, it is unlikely that the UK's products could enter the EU without further checks at the border. Over time, if there is a divergence between the UK and EU standards, which we know these Brexiteers want to do, UK businesses would need to produce 2 different product lines. This would be a massive cost to producers, and we've talked about this before. But Brexiteers just wipe it off as if it was something easy that they'll overcome. So one for the UK and one for the EU, which would increase costs and reduce competitiveness. Again, they're talking about, oh, we want the UK to compete on a world level. The UK can already compete on a pretty good world level being in the EU. Pulling it out, as we've just been through there, makes competitiveness even harder. So the impacts of non-tariff barriers would be large for the service sector, which makes up 80% of the UK economy. And we've talked about this before, how they ignore the fact that we are a service-based economy. 80%, that's a huge margin. And we only can achieve that through the single market, which has made arrangements for services. There is no other trade deal, bar the single market, that makes arrangements for services. Yeah. So, to access to the single market, the EU aviation market requires headquarters and majority shareholdings to be located within the EU, so it can have regulatory oversight on safety. UK service exporters would also suffer the loss of passporting rights for financial services, as well as reduced access to other services provided, such as the legal and accountancy services. The Centre for Economic Performance estimates that a no-deal World Trade Organization rules-only scenario would reduce the UK's trade with the EU by over 40% over 10 years. This reduced trade would mean a fall in income per head for 2.6 per year, and that's the net of the savings from no membership fees. They would also have longer-term negative effects for lower investment, slower productivity growth, which are estimated to be another 3.5% of GDP. Adopting a policy of unilateral free trade would mitigate these costs, but the savings from unilateral tariff cuts are estimated to just be 0.35% of GDP. The short-term disruptions resulting from the sudden imposition of WTO rules could exacerbate these negative effects. And this was done by, I don't know how you say her name, but it's Swati Dari. I think that's how you say her name. I don't know, but it's there, essentially. So, yeah. You know, as usual, a no-deal scenario is just not acceptable. And if that's where we are come February, there should be an absolute halt, and every single MP who wants to remain should just ditch party loyalty and just say, no, we're remaining in the EU. Because us leaving on a no-deal scenario would be an absolute catastrophe. Yet it's what these ideological Brexiteers have somehow magically fantasized about in their minds, how amazing it's going to be. Well, it's not going to be amazing for about 99% of the country. Only the 1% of the absolute most wealthy people in the UK will have any effect, will escape any effect. And when you look at the government's own impact analysis, the North East is set to fall behind by about 16% GDP on a no-deal Brexit scenario. Considering particularly Yorkshire, and this area is still suffering from the effects of the miners' strike, the 2008 financial crash, and now potential of a no-deal Brexit, how bad do you think it's going to get in the North East? It's going to get incredibly bad. But the North East was one of the areas that heavily voted for Brexit, and all these people are going to find out soon. This is why it was a bad idea to vote for Brexit. So good luck, guys. You know, I'm in the town that was third on the list to vote for leave. So, yeah, it's going to be an absolute disaster. And we should absolutely fight now to stay in the EU. There's no other option. If no deal is becoming the option, then we should basically just say, sod it, we're staying in the EU.